as I say, if we go back to this fundamental ideology of power and control, then yes, that's something I've pointed out many, many times. This is the sort of the foundational mythos of royalty itself. Why does royalty exist? Why are there families that just by virtue of their blood are fit to rule over entire nations? It's because way back, if you want to go far enough back, the Egyptian emperors were literally worshipped as gods. Ra is a god on Earth. This is a god. In fact, here in Japan, the emperor has traditionally been thought of as a descendant of the gods, and there are people who are crazy enough, I guess, to believe that to this day that this is a literal god on Earth.
In
Um,
North Korea as well. The current
yeah,
North
well,
Korean.
there's crazy. I remember reading crazy stories that are taught about not Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un, no, Kim Song Il, the founder, and how he could walk through walls and how he just all this crazy stuff that's attributed to him. Yes, it's ridiculous to us, right? Because we are enlightened. We know we're 21st century guys. We don't fall for that nonsense. But I think that's exactly why that very old ideology, which again literally used to be kings are gods. They are literal gods, and then it became the divine right to rule. No, God has given the power to this ruler to rule over the people, and then that gets devolved or evolved or whatever into democracy itself, because now it's like, no, there's sort of this nebulous power of the people, and the people get to invest that power at times in certain different people. And yeah, there's still this royalty, but they're not really ruling anything. Just don't look at how much money they actually have, or any of their actual holdings, or any of their actual political influence. That's not important. And then it kind of morphs into this 19th century conception, which I've identified many times. Eugenics is that old divine right of rule, but it's sort of morphed into the new speak of the post-enlightenment, in which now we're in this scientific era where we need some sort of scientific rationale for the reason why there are these groups that are fit to rule. Is it because God appointed them? No, it's because their genes are better than yours, and so they get the right to do what they want with you. Essentially, is the ultimate push of the eugenicists. And it's difficult for us to understand it today because most people don't even know the word eugenics anymore. But back in early 20th century, I should say, it was absolutely the science that everyone was talking about. It was a big deal, and anyone who was anyone was an avowed eugenicist, like the way anyone who's anyone is an avowed climate change, global warming, oh my God, we're all going to die because of carbon dioxide believer these days. You had to at least give lip service to eugenics back in the early 20th century. And that shaped so much of early 20th century progressive politics, the idea of the state as essentially stewarding humanity through cultivation of the good genes into some sort of future utopia. And it always carries with it the dark shadow of what the eugenicists always try to distance themselves from, which is dysgenics. The idea that with eugenics, okay, promote the good genes in society and hope that rich and prosperous people have many children so that they can have big families. The other side of that is dysgenics. Well, these people have defective genes. These people are criminals. They're poor. They just have defective protoplasm, as it was called back in the time, because they didn't even know what it was. And so, what do you do with them? You sterilize them, and eventually you start thinking about killing them. Because, do we really need all these defectives, all these mentally defective people? No, we need to start getting rid of them. And that, of course, that's exactly what happened in the early 20th century.
Yeah. So would you say that the people who have this desire to control other people and just feel that they're better, do they hide behind the government, which is, I know you're an anarchist, so is the government kind of the way they managed to pull this off? Oh yeah.
I am definitely an anarchist. Yes. Yes, exactly right. Government has to be seen for what it is, which is a trough of power. And who goes to feed at the trough of power? All the pigs. Now, it's extremely easy for us to say, oh, look at all those pigs. They're the ones, and they're the problem. But I think people should really need to step back and really interrogate themselves about how much of that ideology they themselves have bought into. I think there's a lot of people who essentially their gripe is, I don't have that power. Man, I wish I had that power, and then I could use the ring of power for good. Of course, everyone feels that temptation, that pull. Oh, if only I could be in charge, or if only the people I like could be in charge, then everything would be so much better. Again, I think this is a really fundamental battle that we have to fight internally, consciously, against even our own tendencies to want to control other people. And again, I think there's many different ways in which we can make that argument. There is the moral argument. There's also a pragmatic argument, because as I say, central planning does not work. You cannot manage human activity, the human flourishing, and have a productive society. You can manage it and have a bunch of automatons that are essentially going to end up devolving into a complete chaos state. But you cannot actively manage humanity. And until we understand that and truly believe it, not just say it, but really understand and believe it at our core, then nothing will change. Because as I say, get rid of the head of the Hydra, there will be a million people tomorrow who would be absolutely lusting over those seats of power.
Mm-hmm. I had a question here about the roundtable group. People call it the Milner group. The main person there that they talk about is Cecil Rhodes. What was I going to say? Yeah, are they still central to this movement today?
I would say the historical linkage of the actual people involved in that. I do not believe that they are still ones in positions of power pulling strings. I think the group itself was always somewhat amorphous, and partly that was part of the way it was set up. So for people who don't know, Cecil Rhodes was a Rothschild made man, who made his fortune in diamonds and essentially used that wealth as a leverage point for political power and political agenda, which, uh, from Rhodes' perspective, he was trying to promote the British Empire and the rule of the British Empire over the whole world, and so he formed a secret society in order to further those goals. And this is, again, it sounds, to people who don't know, it sounds, oh, that's crazy conspiracy. No, this is actual documented history. Look it up. In fact, we have the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes. He had 6 different wills that were being stewarded over by William T. Stead that have been published. You can go read them on archive.org right now, in which he talked about it. There were New York Times, I believe, articles that I cited in my World War I documentary at that time, talking about this secret society that Cecil Rhodes had founded. But the way that he set it up, quite consciously, he set it up on the model of the Jesuits. Because he thought, well, here's an organization that's persisted for centuries and has political power. Why don't we be like them? So he set it up in that way. And G. Edward Griffin gave this incredibly important talk that I've cited many times, because I think it really clearly articulates the sort of the nature of what that group was and how it operated. He called it the rings within rings, which is the idea of you have, as Cecil Rhodes set up, there was this inner core called the Society of the Elect, who would be the real core of this group. And then you'd have people around them who would be told a certain story about what this group is and what they're doing. And then you'd have people around them who would be drawn into this larger organization. And so you have these rings within rings, but only the people in the Society of the Elect, only the absolute core of this group really know what the group is and what it's aimed at and what it's doing. And that's why this particular roundtable society was so influential and so important, certainly in turn of the 20th into early 20th century world politics. And for people who want sort of the inner gritty workings of what they did, who the literal names of these people, who they were connected to, what they actually did, I would highly suggest Carol Quigley. And if you don't want to tackle the 800-page Tragedy and Hope, which is a pretty big book, there's a rather slim Anglo-American establishment book that he wrote that talks about this group and the sorts of things that they were doing, specifically in the run-up to World War I, And then in the run up to World War II, this was, as Carol Quigley said, it was probably the most powerful force in the world that most people hadn't heard of at that point in the mid 20th century. Those particular people and their offspring, I don't think this was sort of the intergenerational thing that some other secret societies may be. So I would need a lot more evidence presented that particular group persisted, but the organizations that group created persisted. The Council on Foreign Relations in the United States is a creation of that group. The Royal Institute for International Affairs. There's a version of that in every one of the crown countries, essentially, and in non-crown countries like the United States. And those groups have inordinate amounts of power in the foreign policy space and continue to have that power. So that is one way you could look at sort of the legacy of that roundtable group that still persists to this day. I just don't think it's necessarily the same people or the same families running that.
Right. So I was going to ask as well, concerning the royalty, like the monarchy you mentioned, the British, do they? I was going to ask about the Vatican as well, because you mentioned the what is it, the circles within circles,
Yeah, the
and the
Jesuit
Jesuit
order.
order.
Yeah.
Is the Vatican like involved in this, or was that just a coincidence? And do they? Because I know the kings say they have a divine right to rule. Like,
Right.
what do they believe, like, in the church? Are they like given that by the church?
Right. Well, there's always, I mean, you could go back thousands of years talking about the tensions between royalty and the spiritual power, and the Catholic Church obviously having been an integral part of that in European history. But yes, are elements of the Vatican and certain offshoots and groups and the Jesuits and the P2 Masonic Lodge and other weird things happening in Rome, are those sorts of groups associated with this grander conspiracy? Absolutely so. And one way that has been framed in the past, I know that people have talked about the empires of the city, and talking about the city of London, which is different than London. The city, the square mile, the city of London is the sort of bankster heart of London, which is actually its own separate area, and I believe even the Prime Minister has to ask permission in order to enter the city of London, that square mile. And there's all this weird ritual stuff around that. The Vatican, again, Vatican City, which is its own state. And you actually cross the border when you go from Rome into Vatican City. And Washington, D.C., I think, was the other empire of the city that was talked about in that regard. So there's definitely a nexus there. And again, there's a rotating cast of characters that come in and out of these positions. And I think if people get hung up on the idea that it's all being controlled by a certain family or something along those lines, I think they miss the deeper picture of this, which is, okay, so if that's the case, then we just kill everyone in that family and the world will be all magically better overnight. No, reality does not work that way. It is about an ideology. It is about an ideology of control. People who genuinely believe they deserve to rule over other people, to create money for the benefit of themselves, their families, and their friends. That is the system that we're trying to really topple here. And that's something that has to be done from the conscious perspective. I think we need a conscious revolution in order to not make a system whereby if we take out the people who happen to be sitting in those particular positions of power today, there'd be a million people who would love to step into those positions tomorrow. We have to create the conditions so that those positions, A, don't exist, and B, people don't want to step into those positions of power. Because I genuinely believe the world would not only be sort of better in some sort of moral sense, although I think that too, obviously, but really it would function much, much better for humanity as a whole if we did not have these positions of centralized power. Because as people like Hayek and others have elaborated at great length in the past, people who believe that they can control society and control the actions that people are taking, control their transactions, control their interactions, try to centrally plan everything, are hindering humanity, not helping it. Because the real beauty and wisdom of humanity comes through people pursuing their own ends independently and interacting in whatever way they see fit to create the society that becomes infinitely more complex than any central planner could even comprehend, let alone actually manage.